Good morning. I know exactly what you're thinking right now. That lucky dog gets to take off his mask. But it's good to be here with you. We're so thankful to be here with you. What a weird time it has been. And I know y'all have gone through a lot of change in the past year. And we have too. And we just appreciate each one of you and encouraging us and appreciate our elders for everything that they've done behind the scenes and getting this all set up so that we could safely meet today. And all the hard choices they've had to make in the past just several months is very appreciative of all three of them and the encouragement that they've been to us through this all. Cassidy and I, a couple weeks ago, as we think about how things have changed over the past couple months, is we were watching a reality TV show, and this couple were on a date, and they walk into a bowling alley and start bowling, and we stopped and thinking, what are they doing in a bowling alley during social distancing? Of course, we didn't think, it was our first gut reaction, not even thinking about this had been recorded months ago before all this happened. But things have just dramatically changed for us. And in that, it's probably been difficult for you at times to have peace. In order to feel like everything's going to be okay and to feel safe. And I hope that you have, but I realize too that during this time, maybe it's been a struggle for quite a few people today. And as I've told you before, I like to play tennis. And there's some days when I'm playing tennis that everything just seems to go right. I go out there, barely have to warm up, and I can just hit the ball exactly where I want it to go and make very few mistakes. And it feels good. Everything just feels like it's right. But then there's other days where it's not like that. In fact, it doesn't matter how much I warmed up or how much I stretched, but I just can't seem to hit the ball. I can't seem to get it to go exactly where I want it to go. And maybe you've had a similar experience if you play a sport or if you have some other type of hobby where there's some days it just seems to really be going right, and then other days it doesn't. We've recently been going through a time where it seems like everything, just one thing after another, seems to be going wrong. And it can be hard for us to feel like all is right during those times. It can be hard for us to feel peace. Our passage this morning is in Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. And here, and I've already said this through this series, but here, Paul is in prison. Paul is not in a very peaceful place. He's not in a place where we would think that all is right and that everything is just going how he thinks it should have been going. He was not in a place of peace. He's in prison. And at that, he's in a Roman prison. 2,000 years ago, as you can imagine, probably not much like what prisons are like today. Much worse. And then on top of that, you think about the Philippians, who he's writing to, they're also not in a very peaceful place. Because if you remember in Acts chapter 16, Paul had converted Lydia and then converted the Philippian jailer and established the church there in Philippi. And so he started the church. He planted the church there in Philippi. And so you think about the Philippians here, they're not in a peaceful spot because the person who established their faith and led them to Christ is now in prison. I want you to think for a second, who led you to Christ? Think about that person, whoever led you to Christ, who studied with you, who baptized you. Maybe you're thinking of a teacher, maybe it was a camp counselor, maybe it was a past preacher, maybe if you're like me, it was your parents, whoever that might have been. And then I want you to think about how you would feel if that person was arrested for preaching the Word of God, for doing exactly what they had done for you in leading you to Christ. They are now in prison because of that. You have feelings of anger. You probably have feelings of fear because the same thing might happen to you because all that person was doing was teaching the Word of God. And so that's how the Philippians are feeling here. And so then Paul here, as he started to conclude his letter, and what we're going to see today, he offers some encouragement to them. And he offers them these, I guess you could say, steps or commands, but they're not really a command as like we would think like, thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do this. But Paul's encouraging them, telling them, okay, if you do these things, you're going to be able to experience the peace of God even in this messed up, crazy, chaotic situation. And so that's what we're going to see this morning, and we're not going to go in depth in this. So as you see this, and I know you're breathing hard in your mask, you're thinking 8 encouragements, but we're going to go through it rather quickly, I promise. And so let's just look at the text here, and we're going to just read it along with, we'll stop at each verse and make a few comments here. And so the first one here in verse 1, he says, therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for. My joy and my crown, stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved. And so he's not talking to strangers here, right? He's talking to people he had helped form their faith. And he calls them, brothers, but then he says, you're my joy and my crown. I want you to think about your kids or maybe your grandkids, and you might describe them as they're the joy of your life, or they're the crown of your life. And that's what Paul is saying about the church here at Philippi. And so in this messed up situation that they have found themselves in, and the fears that they might have, the first thing he commends them or encourages them to do, he says to stand firm through this time, is to stand firm. As I've even in my short life have looked around at those who I grew up with in the church, there's already people who I've seen who have fallen away. And I have no doubt you have people in your life who you've seen fall away from the church. And it's because they didn't stand firm. And that's a hard thing for us to do. Probably at different points in your life you felt that temptation a bit. Or maybe you felt weaker. But it's in those times we've got to take a step and stand firm. A couple weeks ago I was fishing with my father-in-law over at Woolly Hollow. And we were brim fishing. And we were on the other side of the lake towards the highway, and we were just going along the bank there, just fishing with crickets, just trying to see if we could get a couple brim on his boat. And as we were going around the bank, we really weren't catching much. I mean, really, he was catching a lot more than I was, but we weren't catching much. And so finally, there's like this, it was cold, it was kind of windy, and there was this ray of sunshine coming through the trees, and so we started casting right there, and we started getting some brim. And, I'll say he started getting some brim. And so I was trying to get in there too, but the wind kept blowing us up and down the bank, and we're trying to get there. And it was frustrating because we knew, okay, the fish are right there. That's the spot we need to hit. But we couldn't get in there because the wind kept blowing us back and forth. And that's what life can be like during difficult situations, as we try to get our footing, but it seems like everything's going wrong, and we're just trying to get in there and hit the right spot that the Lord wants us to hit. But we oftentimes miss the mark. And what Paul encourages is during those times is to do your best. Come together, as we're going to see in this next point, and be able to stand firm and be able to do what the Lord wants us to do and to continue to live the life that He's called us to live. The second thing we see in verses 2 through 3, he said, and I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. And so it seems what has happened is you have these two women in the church who had some type of disagreement. We're not told anything about that disagreement. It seems to have been pretty serious that Paul needed to mention it into his letter. And really, this situation there, that's really reflective of everything we've read up to this point in Philippians, as Paul's dealing with joy, but he's also dealing with the theme of gospel partnership, which means you and I are working together for the sake and the mission of the gospel. So we have a gospel partnership, if you will. We have this fellowship built on a joint mission. And Paul's leading up in that. In Philippians chapter 2, we talked about how Christ is the ultimate example about not living for his own interest, but living for the interest of others. And then here, as in his closing remarks, he brings up a situation where people were not, in some way, we're not told how, but were not putting their interest down or below themselves for another person. And he says you need to encourage these women in this disagreement to stay united. And that's the command there. It says, help these women. And I think where we can come along with this is during a very unpeaceful time, or a time where it seems like everything's chaos in our country, is that we're able to encourage one another, especially. What a blessing that we're able to come together today. But be able to stay united. Because when stress levels get high, we're out of our routine, things aren't going how maybe they were in normal times, it's really easy for us to start disagreeing with one another. Or it's easy for us to throw our opinions, or we throw self-preservation for ourselves, or we're more concerned about our family than anything else. And those are natural human inclinations. What Paul is encouraging them here is help these women to do what I told you to do in chapter 2. And of course they didn't have chapter 2 per se, but what I just told you to do a few moments ago is to be like Christ, to put others' interests above your own. And then we go down to verse 4, and what an encouraging verse is. He tells them, you want to have peace, then you're going to have to learn to rejoice even in the tough times. It says, rejoice in the Lord always, and again, I say rejoice. And in times like these, maybe that's been hard, depending on your situation. Maybe you have family who's been infected with this virus. And so it's one thing for me, who I don't know anyone personally, to kind of brush this off, but maybe you've actually had some people who've had this and you've seen what it can do. And it's been hard for you to find joy. Or maybe just being away from the assembly. I know that's been for me. It's been hard preaching into a camera, right? That's difficult. Me and Brother Eddie and Brandon have been talking about that a lot, how weird it is. And so if I might find myself just looking at Eddie or just looking at Brandon. So just ignore that. I've just been doing that for 2 months, so that might happen. But we're together again, and we're able to rejoice with one another. And that's all about the unity we see there too. And then his fourth encouragement here in verse 5. He said, let your reasonableness or gentleness, maybe a better way to translate that, be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. And just like we said, during a high-tense situation where everything's not normal, we're going through some stressful situations, it's easy for us not to act in an unreasonable, or it's easy for us to not act in a reasonable way. But Paul says, even in these stressful situations, even in these moments where it's hard to find peace, we've got to let our reasonableness and our gentleness be known. That's really tough if you try to walk into Walmart and the person takes the last toilet paper or the last hand sanitizer and you try to reach in there and grab it. That's tough. Or it's tough when we're on the highway and someone cuts us off. Or it's tough to let our reasonableness be known to all when we've been ripped off at a store, or someone charges us double for something that was not supposed to be so high. It's hard during those times. But Paul says, let your gentleness be known to all people. And we've got to admit, there's times in our past where maybe we haven't been the most reasonable person at times. And especially when we've been in a stressful situation. And there's times where Christians around us haven't acted in a reasonable way. And we realize that. But we need to be exhorted here, as Paul is doing, is to strive for that. And I think maybe the best way to ask yourself, okay, have I been a reasonable person during this stressful situation, is one, you can ask your spouse, or I'll ask your spouse and they can tell me no, but or ask your co-workers in any situation, is so-and-so a reasonable person? And you'll probably get some kind of an answer there that you maybe not like, but that's a good way of testing it. And so are you a gentle and reasonable person, even in the midst of an unpeaceful situation? Or are you someone that the people around you have to study a book on how to deal with difficult people in order to interact with you? I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves in this verse. But then look at verse 6, and wow, that speaks to exactly what we've been in. As Paul says this, he said in verse 6, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. And so what he says is, do not be anxious. Do not worry. And we see that all over the Bible. You see that Jesus saying that in Matthew chapter 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, is not to worry about our food or our clothing, but to seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. And it says that God will take care of those things in your life. But what this means, it doesn't mean that you can't have any worries at all. I've heard that been said before, where it says, as if you were to read that as saying, thou shalt not worry. And if you worry once, then you've committed sin. Because we see disciples throughout time, and I think even at times we saw Jesus worry for those around Him. When Lazarus died, remember what Jesus did? It says Jesus wept. Not because He knew the outcome wasn't going to be good, but because he was worried about those who were around Him. And so this isn't a command as far as do this or I'm going to judge you or condemn you, but this is saying, listen, God's got this. You don't have to worry about what's going on right now because we serve a God who is infinitely bigger than whatever situation we're going to find ourselves in. And so Paul said in any situation, you've got to go to your Father in prayer and let your requests be made known to Him. That's the sixth encouragement. Is first, don't be anxious about anything, but in order to overcome that anxiety that we have, he says, let your request be made known to God. It's because, as 1 Peter 5, verse 7 tells us, is that God cares for us and God is there to listen to us in every struggle that we might have. And prayer is something that's probably hard for us to explain to an unbeliever who just doesn't quite understand why we do that, but What they don't understand is not necessarily the practice of it, but it's the person we're praying to that we have our faith in. It's the person that we're talking to, the God of all creation that we believe is on the other side of that prayer, who is listening to us, who is striving to work all things together for good for us, the church, and to those who love Him, called according to His purpose. And then these last two we find in Philippians 4 verse 8, as it relates to this idea, is he says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things." And what that means is, okay, all of these positive things. Think about who God is. Think about what He's done for us. Think about what is true. Think about what is right. And focus on those things. Meditate on those things. And that can be hard. If at your house you've got the news running 24/7. I'm not saying bury your head in the sand. By no means. You've got to know what's going on. But if we're constantly listening to what the world says is wrong in the world, we're going to find ourselves discouraged. Because we're meditating, we're thinking about those things. But instead, Paul says, I want you to think about the things that are good. Think about the spiritual realities you know to be true, that were proven true, that when Jesus Christ was buried into the grave and that He rose to walk in the resurrection, He said when He did that, He proved these things to be true. These things are true. These things are praiseworthy. These things are commendable. He says, focus on those things. I did a sermon, it was like my first week here online, and it was, "You are what you think." Is whatever we spend our time dwelling on and whatever we think about and we meditate on, that's going to turn into our actions. That's going to turn into how we live and how we talk. And so we've got to think about the things of God. And during a difficult time, instead of pushing us away from church, that ought to allow us to create opportunities just like we have, where we may be even studying the Bible more during the week than when we were before this situation. And I hope that would be the case. And then this last point that Paul makes here, verse 9. He says, "What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things," or do these things. And so Paul is leaving this letter, as he's starting to bring this letter to a close, and he's talking about the past paragraph and maybe even referring to the whole letter as a whole. He's saying, okay, and as you walk away from this letter, I want you to actually put this stuff into practice. And that's a lesson really of itself. In James chapter 1, 19 through 21, he says, "Be doers of the word, and not hearers only." And isn't that the great challenge of the Christian life, as we come here weekly, or we go online weekly now, and we get the information. But the challenge is for us to be able to take that and change how we live when we leave the building or when we turn off the live video feed. It's for us to be different people. Is that it's good to have Bible knowledge. That's a blessing. That helps us know who God is. That helps us know what we ought to do. But we read the Bible. We preach the Word, not just for the sake of information, although information is important, but we do it for the sake of transformation, that we would be more like Jesus and that we would be more like God. That's the purpose. And that's what Paul says, is put these things into practice. Don't just let this be a great letter from our friend Paul, but let this be something that is life-changing and influences our habits, influences our actions, and influences how we treat our neighbor. And so Paul gave us those 8 encouragements here. He gave the church of Philippi those 8 encouragements. And then he gives us these 2 promises here. He says, number 1, if you do these things, this is the promise he gives us, is that the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds. Is that you have the peace of God, and that is a security that no amount of insurance can give to us, no amount of security team can give to us, no amount of military can give to us, but you are given the peace of God, knowing that your spiritual realities are true in Christ Jesus, and that nobody can touch that. But then number 2 gives us the promise of this, is that the God of peace will be with you. And so God's going to give you peace, and He's going to do so by being with you, is that you have His presence with you. And Jesus promised that, did He not? In the Great Commission, when He says, "Go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature," and He says, "And lo, I am with you even to the end of the age," is that we truly have God with us. And so here's what my main point for you this morning, to kind of sum this up, is that if we change the way that we live, if we try to live to these encouragements that Paul has given us in this passage, and if we would seek God in a way that is beyond understanding, that means it's not going to make sense to a whole lot of people in our life. Right now, you're sitting in a church building, a lot of people in our nation would think you're crazy for coming together this morning because of this. But you have a love for God, and we believe we were able to do so in a safe way, but still, that's beyond understanding for some people why you would risk it to worship God. And that's what Paul's point here is, that if we seek God in a way that is beyond understanding, that He will give us a peace that is beyond understanding. And the world's not going to be able to grasp that. They're not going to be able to understand why we're able to act in such a gentle and reasonable way in a time of crisis. They're not going to be able to understand why we're able to rejoice, or why we're able to stand firm in our faith, or why we're able to stay united. They're not going to understand that, because it is a peace that surpasses all understanding. And so if you had some struggles recently, have you struggled to have peace during a time like this? And if that's true, number one, I want to say this is congratulations, you're a human being. We all have struggles. We all struggle to have peace at times. We all have anxieties. We all have worries at times in our life. But the thing that is different between us and the unbelievers is that although we both have struggles, although there's times where we struggle for everything to just feel right and for everything to feel at peace, is that the difference between us and them is that we have a God who gives us His peace and who is with us in giving us His presence. And so if we're